on loneliness at work and why it matters in film and TV. My name is Andrea Wigfield, and if you flip on the next slide, Abba, please. This is our team. Professor Andrea Wigfield is leading the project. Unfortunately, Andrea is unwell with the flu today, so she's not able to join us, but I will be chairing the meeting in her place. We have Dr. Anna Topakas, who is a senior lecturer in work psychology from the University of Sheffield. Good morning, Anna. We have Rupert Jones-Lee, head of research and impact at Film and TV Charity, and Lucy Maxwell, community development manager at Film and TV Charity. So welcome to our three speakers today. And next slide, please. So I'm just going to do a very short now introduction to what we will have in our webinar today. I just want to say to everyone that we will be recording the session and we will make it available through the hub later after the end of the webinar. So I will just give a 2-minute talk about why loneliness at work matters. Then we'll have a little bit of a background history on the Film and TV Charity and their Looking Glass survey. We will have an expert view from Anna Topakas, followed by Lucy Maxwell, who will be discussing an overview of what the film charity are trying to find out and what their current and future work around workplace loneliness is. So next slide, please. So why does loneliness at work matter? Next slide. So loneliness affects health and well-being of individuals across the board. My background is in psychology, so I do a lot of work on the psychological basis of loneliness, and a lot of my work is around the relationship between loneliness and mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and so on. But also there is another angle to why this is particularly interesting to people working in the field of loneliness, and that's because there are certain cognitive processes that are very important to creativity. Workplace creativity is very important for the well-being, but also the production and performance of employees. So next slide, please. So loneliness affects work performance at work in various ways, and these are only a few of the indicators that we have been measuring over the time. So it leads, or it is related to less engagement and lower job satisfaction. As I mentioned earlier, it is linked with various cognitive processes that support creativity. But not only that, in a way, we can see that people that are isolated or lonely at work, they have less chances of working together, and therefore creativity and innovation is also affected in that way. There is an impact on teamwork, and because it's linked to physical problems, there is an increased absenteeism that costs a lot of £1 million per year to employers. So very important topic. And I think it's very central to the interests and research, groundbreaking research that is currently happening in the UK, but also abroad. Next slide, please. So I will pass over to Rupert. Thank you, Rupert, for joining us. And would you give us a little bit of background about the Film and TV Charity? And then we'll all ears. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Antonia, and thank you everyone for having Lucy and I today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Rupert Jones-Lee. I'm head of research and impact at the Film and Television Charity, and we're working with the Centre for Loneliness Studies at Sheffield Hallam and Sheffield Universities on a project that my colleague Lucy will talk about a little further. But what I wanted to do was set it up by explaining a little bit about who we are and why we've come to be so interested in loneliness, indeed to think that it's at the heart of the well-being work that we do for our clients. I should just say up front, I will make a small reference to a statistic about suicidal ideation. I won't be discussing that in any depth, but it's just by way of warning. Okay, so the Film and Television Charity supports people working behind the scenes, behind the camera in film, television and cinema in the UK. So that basically means not actors. It's the people who make the content and get it to audiences. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is a statement of our charitable object, which is basically our purpose. And the critical points to note here are the prevention or relief of poverty, the promotion of physical, mental and social well-being, and the promotion of equality, diversity and inclusion. So our origins were as a benevolent fund, and until maybe about 6 years or so ago, our focus was primarily on working with individual beneficiaries and working with the industry to support those beneficiaries. What we historically did was work with people who were in need because they were out of the industry because of old age, illness, protracted periods of unemployment. And we gradually came to realize through the work we were doing with clients that there was a great deal of need amongst people who were active industry professionals. So we expanded our focus to be providing support for people who were actively in the industry. And this is basically, our industry is sometimes it's been described as the original gig economy. It's characterized by casualisation of labour. It's heavily freelance. Somewhere between about half and 2/3 of the workforce are freelance. It's quite difficult to quantify exactly because a lot of those are so-called PAYE freelancers. As I say, they share a lot of the characteristics in terms of precarity of people who are self-employed or trading through limited companies, but they're actually on payroll. ONS doesn't record those stats, so there's a degree of uncertainty, but it's significantly freelance, working on projects typically, bouncing from one to another, and in a context where there's a lot of outsourcing and basically obscured supply chains from commissioners to production companies to teams within work and down ultimately to individuals. A lot of cost and risk is cascaded. So amongst the forms of support that we started to develop around that point to support people was a support line. This is a free 24/7 confidential support line for primarily targeted at people who are active industry professionals, and we started getting a lot of evidence coming through. There was an abnormally high prevalence of mental health problems amongst those clients. When we looked around for an evidence base, however, we couldn't really find one. There was a very short Australian report focusing on mental health and well-being in the film and television industry, a longer Irish report looking at the creative industries as a whole. So what we decided to do, we needed to build our own evidence base. We could go to the next slide, please. Sorry, could we get the next slide? Thank you. So 5 years ago, no, thanks, that's great. 5 years ago, we conducted the first of our Looking Glass surveys. These normally run every other year. There were surveys in 21 and 22 for odd reasons, but we've run them now across 4 years. And what they exposed, the picture across those, by the way, is remarkably consistent. One, I'll be referring at various points to the most recent one we've just conducted a few months ago, which will be published, by the way, in January, February 25. What we found basically was an epidemic of mental health problems. That was a term used by our partners on the first survey, Mind, who are reputable, highly creditable body. Could we go to the next slide? Some of the headlines that we found are as follows. So two figures that we use a lot that are not benchmarked against reference data, but they're very telling, are how people rate their own mental health and whether they think the industry is a mentally healthy place. 35% rating their mental health poor or very poor is a worrying figure. It's deteriorated since the last Looking Glass, largely because the last 18 months to 2 years in the industry have been very challenging with the production downturn, strikes, cost of living crisis. There's been a fractional improvement in people's perception of how mentally healthy the industry is as a place to work, but it's still, you can see only 12% thinking that it is a mentally healthy place. When we look at something that we can benchmark against reference data, the short Warwick Edinburgh score, what we see is Again, a deterioration over the last 2 years, but this is important, a significantly less than amongst the population as a whole. Could we take the next slide? Thank you. These are some further insights. We can see that compared with the national average, suicidal ideation in the last 12 months is shockingly higher amongst our respondents than amongst the population. A lot of people thinking about leaving the industry, and this is really the only direct point I'm going to make about loneliness in this, by the way, because Anna and Lucy will talk about this in more depth. But when we look at the extreme end of the UCLA score, which ranks between 3 and 9, we can see that 30% of our respondents are often lonely, and that compares with 8% in the general population. Next slide, please. At a surface level, we can group the drivers behind this in 3 buckets in terms of condition, culture, and capability. And the factors that we identify here are ones that are not at all surprising. They're concerns about money, long hours, experience of bullying, harassment, and discrimination, lack of managerial support, this kind of thing. But the data set that we generate, because they're getting on for 90 questions, many of which are multi-code, the number of permutations you can get is absolutely enormous, and it would defeat normal analysis. So what we decided to do was to conduct, or to commission rather, something called a factor analysis, which is essentially, sorry, I'm going to put this in non-specialist terms, but it's essentially looking for kind of hidden correlations underneath the data. What we found was quite surprising, and this is my last slide. If we could just go to that, please, Abba, that'd be great. Thank you. What we found was that overwhelmingly the biggest influence on the mental health of respondents, positively or negatively, was their loneliness or lack of social connection. It outweighs all of the other factors, all of the next 5 factors combined. And so we wanted to understand more about this, and this is essentially this is a prelude to the work that we're conducting now. We, by the way, have just redone this factor analysis. This was done on the 2021 data set. We've just redone it on the 2024 data set, like yesterday, or finished that work yesterday, and found very much the same result. So it's a confirmation of this finding. What we didn't know and still don't know was what loneliness means for workers, what the lived experience is like, what the barriers are to making an intervention in it. And that's what my colleague Lucy will be closing with. But we decided that we needed to talk further with experts. So we worked with Andrea and her colleagues to get a sort of insight in general state of thinking on loneliness. And that resulted in a report, which is it was completed last year, but we recently published it, co-published it. And that's what I'm going to pass over now to Anna to talk about further. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Have I got audio? Yes. Yes, thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Rupert. So I would like to summarize the key messages, key findings from a non-systematic review of the literature that we conducted, commissioned by the Film and TV charity, led by Professor Andrea Wigfield, and with contributions from Dr. John Ratcliffe as a researcher on this project, and myself. Next slide, please. Right, and to get us all warmed up and interacting, may I ask who is able to please join this WooClub exercise, wooclub.com, and enter the event code XSFTBG, or on your device you can scan the barcode there, the QR code. And please give as many answers as you can think of to the question, what does loneliness mean to you? They can be short answers, single word answers. They don't have to be very long, as many as you want. Just press enter to load these. And yeah, how does loneliness feel? What does it mean? What is loneliness? I'll give everyone a couple of minutes, in fact, 2 minutes to upload their answers. been 1.5 minutes and we already have plenty of answers. So I'm going to just continue, share with you the answers that you have given. There is a lot here and it's all very valid and valuable. Not being understood, very interesting. Spending a lot of time alone, feeling sad. So there's definitely a feeling or emotional aspect to it. Distrusting others, absolutely. Sometimes even distrusting ourselves. Isolation. To summarize everything, I'm going to try and make a word cloud for us. Lack, absolutely. The difference between what we want and what we get in relating. Absence of a connection. Brilliant. Wow, a beautiful word cloud of loneliness. Thank you, everyone. I will stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to appreciate where your perception of loneliness sits alongside others. I'll stop presenting and then ask from our host to share my slides again. Next slide, please. Right, so what is loneliness by the textbooks? So there are four, well, there are more, but 4 common perspectives to understanding loneliness and studying loneliness, exploring it from an academic perspective. The first and most prominent or common one is the psychological perspective. According to this, and like you have identified in some of these quotes, loneliness is the distress, so a feeling, a negative feeling that is experienced when a person's actual social connections and relationships do not meet their desired levels for connections and relationships. And this can mean meeting the desired quality, quantity, and quantity within context, perhaps, in terms of relationships. From an evolutionary perspective, loneliness is useful, is an adaptive feeling, at least in the short term, because it motivates us to take actions, to seek and strengthen social connections, reconnect with people, maintain, sustain, build relationships. However, and this does not contradict the psychological perspective, but there is also the challenge of long-term loneliness, which no longer functions as such an adaptive mechanism for motivating action, and it may instead cause people to develop negative opinions or thoughts about themselves and about others' motives and about others' intentions. Then we have the philosophical perspective on loneliness, which see loneliness and solitude as a part of what being human is. These feelings are not necessarily positive or negative. They're just part of our experience as humans. And from this perspective, perhaps loneliness fits well with creative workers who draw on these emotions, positive, negative, or otherwise, to express themselves and provide the product of their labor, which is often the artistic output. And then from a sociological perspective, loneliness emerges from the interaction of the person with their social environment, their social context, and so not having meaningful interactions, opportunities for meaningful interactions, and the space, place, and context for belonging can give rise to loneliness. And these are social contextual factors that are often outside of the control of the individual in a sense. Right, next slide, please. So in summary, loneliness is a very personal experience because of the baseline level of desired connections and quality and quantity. So we all have a different expectation, a different need for connecting and desire. And so it's kind of difficult to find a one-size-fits-all solution to loneliness, especially since, many introverted person or people who need and pursue few deep connections might say that the social expectation of many shallow connections could not resolve and instead cause loneliness in them, and vice versa. So it's something to be understood. It's very personal, very, very individual. We're all different in this respect. Meaningful interactions and social connections are important for preventing people experiencing loneliness, and by extension, an opportunity for such meaningful interactions and social connections. Then there is obviously cultural and political context, which can frame whether and why people may feel lonely. Also, they may frame whether people feel bad for feeling lonely, whether people are comfortable talking about loneliness. And I think maybe to this item, we can add financial or socioeconomic context based on the findings that Rupert shared earlier. Fourth, loneliness is strongly linked to other forms of poor mental health, again, as borne out in Rupert's findings from the two surveys. And evidence, I think, points in a bidirectional kind of association between the two to show that both poor mental health can lead to loneliness, but also loneliness can lead to poor mental health. So that these two are intertwined. And finally, with some exceptions, there are no clear demographic predictors of loneliness, which means that it can happen to all of us. It does happen to all of us. We all at some times experience it. So belonging in a minoritized group can actually put you at a higher risk in some context, which is why I said there are some exceptions. But on the whole, I think we need to embrace loneliness as an experience that nobody is immune to. Let's put it that way. Okay, next slide. Now, workplace loneliness. So we're talking about a specific industry here. So it's important to focus in on the role of work for providing that platform for social connection. And workplace loneliness is a situationally contingent experience of loneliness, meaning that some people, or all of us presumably, have a certain level of desire for social connection while working. And that also fluctuates from person to person. Some people fulfill their needs and desires for connection and relationships outside of work. Some, especially those who spend a big part of their life working, may rely on the work context or expect the work context to provide opportunities for such relationships and connections that will satisfy their relational needs. Now, workplace conditions, poor conditions, may have a negative impact on loneliness. We know from evidence, as Antonia mentioned in the introduction, that loneliness is associated with lower creativity, lower productivity. And there is a specific kind of tension, because we can be very productive in the short term, not interacting with others and just focusing in our workstation, focusing on our project and on the task at hand. But over time, not investing in building and maintaining relationships will have a negative effect on overall productivity. At least that is the tentative evidence that we have from the literature. Nothing too conclusive as yet. It's still a young research area. And the good news is that loneliness can be alleviated probably through many mechanisms, but for which we have evidence is the problem-focused thinking and a form of confidence or skill building, not necessarily social skills or confidence in social settings, but actually skill building in the professional domain. So when people don't feel like an imposter, or when they don't feel like they're less skilled than their colleagues, they're much more likely to be open to relationship building with feeling confident about their professional standing. Right, next slide, please. Now, in the film and TV industry, the work conditions, like Rupert mentioned, especially those to do with work precarity and the associated financial instability, long working hours, and unfortunately a culture of mistreatment that seems to come through in this research, in the survey findings, likely contribute to alienation and low well-being overall among this workforce. And some further evidence from the literature that we glean from what is known, again, I would say tentative because we don't have large-scale studies that can be generalized here, is that in this specific industry, it is rather difficult to build and maintain relationships. And this is because most work is done around specific projects. Those projects are high pressure, high pace. Large teams of people come together to deliver, so they relate intensely for a short period of time, and then they are forced, in essence, to abruptly stop working together, which can be cause difficulty, a sense of loss or grief of these relationships. Another challenge is the reliance on networks and networking for securing work and learning the ins and outs of the industry, what is happening and where, and this may impede authentic interactions. I joked earlier to say that I would not be able to behave authentically if I needed to network on the golf course. I've never been on a golf course, so I would be forced to engage in or at least to attempt inauthentic interaction. And then the other challenge is the problem with identity and meaning. Workers in this domain contribute to large-scale products or creations, but they don't necessarily feel connected to the final product and to the experience of the people consuming this product or interacting with this product, so that their sense of connection with the outcome of their labor and meaning could be compromised due to this dynamic. Right, next slide. Yes, final slide. Some thoughts about tackling loneliness, and this is from the literature, but there is definitely further work, further research required before we can say with any confidence about which of these do work or work better than others, especially for such a unique industry such as the TV and cinema and film. Right, the first one, a very common approach, is social prescribing, that is directing people and connecting them to activities, services, groups, and charities and service organizations are well placed to provide such opportunities for connecting. The next one, psychological approaches, such as counseling, helping people address negative thinking, negative social cognitions about themselves and about others, can help, especially when people suffer from long-term loneliness. Connecting with groups on the basis of shared interests or identities and peer support can be particularly helpful. However, I will caveat this, as there is a risk that if we encourage people to connect within groups that, let's say, are authentic to them. So if I was a member of a knitting club, I would definitely feel authentic and like I belong. However, maybe those networks that are required for me to progress in my professional domain do not evolve around knitting. And it could be that I do need to learn how to golf in order to be open to these opportunities, the conversations that are happening. So while such groups may alleviate loneliness, they don't necessarily naturally fit with the professional domain and the priorities of people working in the industry. One-to-one exchanges can be more intimate, informal, and can go a long way towards alleviating loneliness. Opportunities for such interactions are important. Technology facilitated, this is relatively new, but has come a long way in recent times, from very sophisticated apps, the equivalent of dating apps only for building professional connections and making friends. But there is also very basic low-tech WhatsApp groups that can actually do the job. They do the job. So there is no need for massive investment, in my view, if people are keen to make a quick, accessible opportunity available. Education and training can help. As I mentioned, people who feel professionally confident are more likely to immerse themselves and approach others within their industry. So providing opportunities for building professional self-efficacy and training is important, but also building people's confidence. A lot of the time, due to the isolation and alienation, people are not aware that they're actually quite good at their job. They have expertise, they have the skills. They just lack the self-awareness and confidence. Addressing stigma is a big one, and it's not just to do with this industry, it's to do with all of us. Lonely people tend to self-stigmatize as well as others stigmatize, and we all seem to tend to stigmatize people who appear lonely, report being lonely, or that we suspect are lonely. So something for everyone to reflect on. Organizing work around smaller, stable teams will help rather than having these intense, large groups around projects. And finally, helping others, volunteering, giving back to the community can go a long way towards satisfying people's need for meaning and relationships and meaningful relationships. Right, I'll leave it there. That's a snapshot. Please feel free to read the full report, which I hear now is publicly available, and we can share a link, I suppose. And over to Lucy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to do this really quickly because we've got some fantastic people in the session, and I think we'd love to hear your reflections and perspectives on what we've been talking about today. So hopefully everyone understands that we've identified loneliness as really prevalent in the workforce, and it is the greatest factor influencing mental health. And Anna's done a brilliant overview of the wider research and what else is out there, the relevant things that we can extract and sort of apply to some of the things we know about the characteristics of the people who work in our industry and the experiences of the work environment. And I think it's also important to say that there's still a real scarcity of evidence around workplace loneliness. I mean, Anna is an expert in this field, but it's a really growing body of research. So we're really excited to be contributing to that. So these are kind of, at the moment, we're hypothesizing around some of the causational factors and potential interventions that could be helpful. And what we haven't really done yet is to delve into the experiences of people working in our sector. Essentially talk to people about this issue who are working in the industry and get their perspectives. So what we're hoping to get from the research that we'll be doing over the next 6 months with Sheffield Hallam, which will include things like, as I've kind of alluded to, focus groups, one-to-one interviews with people working in behind the scenes in film and TV with lived experience. We want to be able to come back and share with you the following. So we've looked at the prevalence of loneliness, as Rupert shared. 30% have a high score on the UCLA scale of 8 to 9, which has gone up in the last couple of years and is much higher than the English benchmark from ONS. So we've really asked in our latest Looking Glass research, where does work factor in? So are people feeling lonely at work? And we'll be sharing more information on those findings, but we do have that information now. And it is a huge proportion of the workforce who are experiencing loneliness at work or feel lonely at work. So we've got more of an insight into where does work play a part here rather than your wider experience of loneliness. We want to have a better understanding of who is most affected. So the demographic groups, is it young people, is it older people, is it people from minority groups, as Anna touched upon? What particular sectors in the industry experience loneliness more, and where do job roles play a part, or seniority if you're in a management position, for example? And as I said, we want to have these first-hand accounts of people with lived experience. So how are people talking about loneliness? What words are they using? What does it feel like for them? And what's their behaviour as a result of these feelings? And the causational factors, we've alluded to some of the ones here, short-term project-based working and then long periods of unemployment, for example. But we really want to try and put get a firmer idea of what these causational factors are. We want to understand what's working. So what's working in the industry, perhaps to build better social connections, but also outside of the industry. What can we learn from other industrial sectors or other areas of society in terms of trying to tackle the experiences of loneliness? And what potentially are the current barriers? We talked about stigma. So what does that look like in our industry, particularly? What other barriers might there be here? Is the very nature of the work itself and the way that we rely on self-employment a barrier, essentially? And what do film and TV workers feel that they need? How can they co-produce the interventions and solutions? And the reason, what we do with that brilliant data next, the next slide, please, is twofold. So essentially, we want to adapt and strengthen the charity's own support provision, what we do for our individual beneficiaries, but also how we support the industry, particularly industry employers, to prevent loneliness at work, find opportunities to prevent it at work, and support lonely employees. So we're due to begin this research this month, be in a position to share all the evidence and insights in time for Loneliness Awareness Week in June next year. I've said it, it's out there. we've got a deadline. So how can you help? If we go to the next slide. So if anyone in this session would like to support us with this work, you will all have your own individual perspectives and insights and experiences here, whether you're in the sector or not. You could have some evidence or research related to a similar sector, maybe one where there's a really big kind of gig economy workforce. Any other relevant research would be really, really welcome, or insights. Support us in our research. So I know that we've got some representatives of industry organisations here today. We'll be putting calls out to engage with the industry around this topic, and we could do with your help with that outreach, and also be part of the solution. So we want to bring groups together of people from different backgrounds and to really come up with what we need to do next, what we need to do to address it, and what's appropriate for the industry right now and for the charities part in that industry. So my contact details are there on the slide. Please feel free to reach out, or if you're on the Tackling Loneliness Hub, you can reach me there as well. And then our film and TV charity handles on there are on all the usual social media platforms too. So follow us for updates on this work and for when we share findings.
Thank you, Lucy. Amazing. Thank you so much, all three speakers, Anna, Rupert, and Lucy. And should we open the floor for questions, comments? You can unmute your microphones if you would like to. You can use the chat if you want to ask any questions. And while people are thinking of their questions, can I just point out, Anna, that because I was really, really intrigued by what you said about authenticity. And recently, very recently, I've been reviewing some data from another industry, the sport industry. And one of the crucial factors that came out from a very big systematic literature review of thousands of athletes, coaches, and the institutions as well, is that there was a lack of opportunity on showing your authentic self. So I think there is a lot of interest in that. And I mean, obviously within the sport industry, that means that because there is a competition between parties, between athletes, between coaches, that kind of prohibits the ability to be authentic, your authentic self. But it just reminds me how important it is to have those authentic relationships with people that are linked to what we've been also talking about quite recently, about meaningfulness of relationships. And those grounds for developing those relationships are very much based on being authentic, trust, building bonds and common interests and so on. So that's really, really interesting. And it draws upon other industries as well as the film and TV. So are there any questions? If anyone wants to join in the discussion, I don't know if, I think you can unmute yourselves. Or you can use the chat if you would like to. We're monitoring both. Okay, it seems that you have done a great job, but let's give a little bit of time. Can I ask whether, okay, so we've got Tash. Many of our members, directors are lone working as self-shooters. Will the research explore that? Lucy, Rupert? Or?
Yeah, I think we'll be looking at all the sort of relevant factors to try and work out. Also, I think what you're alluding to there, Tash, as well, is are some job roles potentially leaving people more at risk of the experience of loneliness, and as you say, that can also relate to particular genres, you know, wildlife genre, for example, where there are a lot of producer, director kind of roles where you are out on your own and you are might be in a different country and all of those things. I guess, but there's an important consideration of which we sort of, Anna was exploring there as well, around the difference between isolation and loneliness. So there may be people who are out there being self-shooters who are having a great time and relishing the opportunity to be isolated. So you could be physically isolated and not necessarily be lonely. But I think we really want to look at genre and parts of the sector where people might have looking at our looking glass research evidence as well, to see from that data who's coming up as lonelier or having highest levels of loneliness. I have a feeling that we're looking at the data at the moment, so we can't say for sure, but for example, people working in post-production or sound, there is some data to suggest that they have higher levels of loneliness.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, the distinction between isolation and loneliness, you know, it's essentially kind of in the case of loneliness, lacking enough sense of connection to other people, whereas being isolated, just literally not being around other people. That distinction is really important, but it's also quite possible that some people who are isolated, like self-shooting PDs, for example, will lack networks, which for other people are really important in sustaining their mental health and well-being. So we certainly will be looking at that, Tash, yeah.
Fantastic. Should we open the, I'll come back to the chat. Should we allow Yahya Bari to raise a hand? Should we, so that we have a mix of audio and written queries? So do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you very much, Antonia, for giving me the opportunity. And yeah, fantastic presentation. Really beneficial. My question is, this is obviously our remit is in the UK, and I'm just wondering, have we looked internationally to see, because a hunch is that people in the global south might suffer less from loneliness, and is there any research to back that theoretical hunch, firstly? And secondly, could it be a possibility that, let's say, learnings could be taken from, let's say, the global south in terms of models and ways of working to alleviate loneliness here in the UK film and TV sector?
Good. Thank you for that. Anna, do you have any insights from the international?
So not from the top of my head specifically about the global south, but I have in mind, and I can't remember the names of some research evidence about relationships. So large relationships with family members, so people who are members of large close-knit family groups, tend to both benefit in terms of loneliness, but also potentially experience higher loneliness where expectations are high and they're not accepted as they are. So just elaborating from my own understanding, that would mean, for example, if you're a LGBTQ plus person and your family is not particularly open to accepting that, you might feel more lonely and isolated. So while there are some things we can understand from context where close relationships are more common, that does not necessarily give us a directly translatable model. But you're right, there could be, and there are definitely societies, communities, and practices that provide opportunities for connection that we are not necessarily aware of or exposed to, so something to explore. It's a very good point.
I was just going to add one thing to that, if I may, which is, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but the WHO Commission on Social Connection, which is looking at global rates of loneliness and social connection, is worth looking at as an overview of that. And they have found that and I'm talking about countries, not necessarily where they're situated, but the level of income of those countries. So whether they're a high income country or low or middle income country, those rates of loneliness or social disconnection are comparable. So this is a global problem. But I think there are, of course, pockets and ways of living and ways of societies that organizing societies that are better at building social connection than others, but it is recognized as a global problem.
Thank you. Should I go back to the chat for Lucy and Rupert? Are the broadcasters and production companies involved in this, and what action will they take?
Lucy?
I'm happy to take that. So I suppose we're just starting out on this, and I suppose we have the support of broadcasters, studios, industry employers, essentially. In general, as an organisation, we have a mental health task force, of which those representatives from the studios and from broadcasters sit on that task force. And this is obviously really clearly linked to our mental health work. This is one of the most important factors that we've identified as being responsible for the outcomes of people's mental health. So we are hoping to galvanise those industry representatives in supporting both the research, but also the findings and recommendations that come out of it. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, the answer to Ruth is that yes, we will share the recording and the slides after the end of this. We tend to do that after each event, so thank you for pointing that out. Can I just go back a little bit to the international aspect that was brought on the floor? We're doing quite a large project with Australia, with the company that collects data from about 5,000 to 6,000 employers from different sectors, and loneliness has been included over the past years into their kind of longitudinal study. And we are writing a report later this year, so watch this space through the campaign to end loneliness, and also obviously with the blogs from the hub, we'll make you aware of the findings, particularly focusing on burnout as well and loneliness in that context. But another thing I wanted to say was that from our research, it seems that because we have so many correlational studies at the moment, particularly on workplace loneliness, we can only assume that these are, causal relationships. So we have to be a bit careful about how we interpret these things. And it would be really nice if we could set up a group and run a longitudinal, so like seeing over time how these feelings of loneliness are experienced in the workplace. Because as Anna said, and I think, Lucy, you touched upon that, persistent loneliness or prolonged loneliness is quite harmful. So that is something that is quite interesting to see within the workplace, as well as outside the workplace. But we do work a lot on chronic loneliness to see whether this prolonged, because there might be times that everybody feels lonely in the workplace, but you kind of dip in and out of these feelings and you try to find ways of alleviating those feelings. But it is that persistence across time that makes things much more impactful on your everyday work, your mental health, your well-being, and so on. So yeah, a lot of things to look on. Okay, and I think you've added a Zoom coffee chat event, so please reach out. There is a LinkedIn on the chat if anyone wants to link, and this is a really good opportunity for these events to link together and hopefully kind of take this a bit forward. Any other questions or comments that anyone would like?
Hi, Antonia. I
Yeah.
believe someone asked a question about grief. Sorry, I
Oh,
missed.
yes, sorry, yes, apology. It's Tash. I think I just saw that Rupert answered that. That's why I kind of skipped over. But can I please that again, bring that, like grief contributes to feelings of loneliness. Is there anyone else that wants to comment on that? Lucy, maybe, or Anna? Definitely what I would say, Tash, is that adverse life events put you at a risk of loneliness, and that grief could be one of those, among others. Even changing workplace or changing any life transition could put you at risk. But as I said earlier, it's not the event itself, is the way that you adapt or adapt to these life transitions and how you are able to respond to them. Like if like Anna said, most of the psychological theories don't see loneliness as a problematic issue. It actually is an alerting mechanism that makes you want to reach out to connect with others. So in theory, loneliness is not a bad thing. What it does is it makes you want to connect with others. It's an alert mechanism. It's a mechanism that functions quite well because we are social beings. It's the cases where this becomes maladaptive that is problematic, and particularly when people have such negative life events like a grief process or even separation from people, even moving homes or moving jobs, or even job insecurity itself can be a very adverse event. That's what that could be a very important risk factor or trigger factor. Anna, do you want to contribute to that?
Yes, just to add that what Tash mentioned about the loss during the time of pandemic, I think is specific in that even if people experience loneliness as a motive to reach out because of the distancing and physical isolation that we were subject to, that may not have been possible. So maybe that transient loneliness became chronic because of the lower opportunity to connect and build new relationships potentially with others. So yes, just to add to what Antonia was saying, that it is a good motivator for us to act, but it can also be difficult when there is no opportunity to act.
And can I just add before we have 1 minute, there is like Abba is mentioning, our community manager, there is a special session around grief and bereavement and other life transitions. There is one session that we are planning at the end of November that is exactly on chronic loneliness and mental health, and it goes beyond the workplace environment. So join us if you see there will be announcements coming up. And next week we have a masterclass on evaluating interventions. So that's another event that we are posting on the hub. I think you might have seen it already. So so hopefully we'll have some more discussions around these commonalities that are underlying loneliness research, but loneliness experiences more widely in the next few months. Right, so thank you primarily to our speakers, but also to everyone that joined us today. And we'll make sure to make everything available to you after the end of the talk. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely comments coming in the chat, everyone. So that's really positive. Thank you very much.